Support for this episode comes from Gvoke HypoPen. Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use rescue pen for treating very low blood sugar in people with diabetes ages 2 and above. If you take insulin or sulfonylureas, you're at risk for your blood sugar going too low. Low blood sugar emergencies can happen unexpectedly, and they demand quick action. You need a safety net when it matters most. Be ready to treat very low blood sugar with Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more. Go to GvokeGlucagon.com/Stacy. That's GvokeGlucagon.com/STACEY. Gvoke shouldn't be used if you have a tumor in the gland on top of your kidneys called pheochromocytoma, or if you have a tumor in your pancreas called insulinoma. Visit GvokeGlucagon.com/risk for safety information.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacy Sims.
This week, it's been 1 year since the Medtronic 780G was approved in the U.S. What does the device and its 7-day infusion set look like in the real world? I'm talking to Medtronic's Senior Director of Global Medical Affairs, Dr. Jennifer McVean. We have a big discussion as well about the future of type 1 diabetes. Dr. McVean has led some significant trials. She lives with type 1 and has some big ideas about changes she'd like to see. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I am always so glad to have you here. You know we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacy Sims, and I just want to say a quick note, a reminder that I have started a second podcast all about type 2. It is called Diabetes Connections Type 2. And we have a really fun episode out right now. It is with a Sports Illustrated swimsuit model. It is the 60th anniversary of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. And they do things a little bit differently these days. They have a contest where regular people, and I'm saying that in quotes because, man, they're all gorgeous, but where regular people can send in their photos to be selected. So my guest is Dr. Nina Cash. She's a retired university dean who decided at age 56 to send in her photo and give it a try. And she lives with type 2 diabetes. So that is the current episode on Diabetes Connections Type 2. And you can find it wherever you have found this show. It's on, every podcast player as well as over at diabetes-connections.com. It's been really fun. I started that show last November. And much like this one, we do technology, a look into the medications, and talk to interesting people who live with type 2. Of course, there's going to be some times when, episodes overlap for both communities, and I'll be sure to bring those to you in this feed as well. Okay, a little bit behind the scenes about this week's interview here. When I reach out to the technology companies, sometimes I'm asking for something or someone very specific. We hadn't talked to Medtronic since last year when the 780G was approved. Yes, it has been out in Europe for a few years. So I just asked them for an interview. To be honest, I thought we would talk nuts and bolts about the system, the longer infusion set, the new sensor that's in use in Europe but isn't yet FDA approved here, things like that. But Dr. Jennifer McVean took us in a different and just as important direction. So look for a future episode more about technology with Medtronic. This week, we do start there. We talk about it, but then we turn our attention to things like the CLEVER trial, which looks at whether closed-loop systems can preserve beta cells, and also to some, frankly, sobering studies about type 1. I will link up those studies in the show notes. You will hear Dr. McVean mention she'll send them to me because we get a little bit in the weeds. You'll know it when you hear it. Okay, my guest this week is Dr. Jennifer McVean. She is a pediatric endocrinologist who lives with type 1 herself. She also has a daughter who has tested positive for one of the autoantibodies. She's Medtronic's Senior Director of Global Medical Affairs, and I'm talking to her right after this. I love when I don't have to deal with a faraway mail order system, when I can just pick up diabetes supplies from the pharmacy. Omnipod is the only tubeless full-feature insulin pump available through the pharmacy. It makes it simple to pick up pods and insulin in the same place, and you avoid those high startup costs from traditional tubed insulin pumps. You simply pay as you pod. Remember, pharmacy means no commitment, and pharmacy means you can switch now, even if your tubed pump is under warranty. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, visit omnipod.com/diabetes connections. Dr. Jennifer McVean, welcome to Diabetes Connections. Thanks so much for being here. I am excited to talk to you and to learn more about what's going on at Medtronic. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Stacey. I'm so excited to be here today.
Before we jump in, do you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself? You live with type 1. You were diagnosed as a tween, as a young kid?
Absolutely. So I live in Minneapolis with my husband, 3 children, and my sometimes well-behaved dog. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 11 in January of 1988. And it certainly is what propelled me to become a pediatric endocrinologist. And now I am a senior director of global medical affairs at Medtronic. And my goal really is to increase access to automated insulin delivery to all people with type 1 diabetes around the world.
You still see patients?
I have seen patients on a limited basis, and I also volunteer at diabetes camp once a year for a week. I've been doing that since, I think, 2005. I was a camper there myself, Camp Needle Point in Hudson, Wisconsin.
Excellent. Oh, such a big fan of diabetes camp.
I loved it as a camper, and I love it as the medical staff, too. It's really amazing.
The way that kids went on pumps obviously has changed a lot since you were a kid, the timing and the availability, I mean, all the technology. But let's just start right there by talking about, we're kind of coming up on the anniversary of one of Medtronic's big changes or big launches. Tell us a little bit, kind of in your words, how you see it. Like, what do you want people to know about the 780G?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I believe automated insulin delivery is the biggest advancement in the care of people living with type 1 diabetes since insulin was discovered over 100 years ago. I started automated insulin delivery myself in 2017, and I had no idea what a peaceful night of sleep was until I started it. I didn't even know that I didn't know, having lived with diabetes for 30 years. And so when you look at the MiniMed 780G system, it is an automated insulin delivery system that is able to target 100 milligrams per deciliter, which is a nearly normal glucose and the lowest that can be targeted. It also has the ability to autocorrect every 5 minutes. And it's been found that autocorrecting early and often to bring those glucoses back down into range more quickly is really important. And then building on the ability of it to autocorrect every 5 minutes is also the meal detection technology. And the meal detection technology is if someone forgets to bolus or undercounts carbs, right, when life happens, then the system kicks in and provides extra insulin to bring the glucose back down into range more quickly. And, those are some of the really exciting things about the 780 and really helping people with diabetes achieve amazing metabolic outcomes, right? Trying to keep that time in range, definitely above 70% and as high as possible. However, the other thing that we're really excited about at Medtronic is how our patients using the system feel. Recently, we had a #1 ranking in overall satisfaction among consumers, and we're proud of that. We needed to make progress there. And so we're excited that with the 780, not only have we been able to help people with diabetes achieve the metabolic outcomes, but also to do it with less burden.
I remember when the 780G came out and we talked about, like you said, if you miss a bolus or it goes, it can correct down to 100. Now that it's been out for a year, what are the real world studies showing you?
Yes, great question. First of all, it's been available outside of the US for about 3.5, almost 4 years. And so we have a very large body of data. But a study that was recently published of over 100,000 real world users showed that when people are using the recommended settings, that the time in range is 80%. We're really proud of that. Additionally, it's also really important when we're talking about time in range to talk about time below range as well. And the system is also achieving the time below range goals of less than 4% below 70 and less than 1% below 54.
I mean, just to stop for a minute, the AID systems are really remarkable that way, aren't they? I mean, as somebody whose son was on a pump 6 months after diagnosis back in 2007, we thought I hate to call it a dumb pump because that's not what it was, but the simple pump perhaps is a better way. We thought that was amazing, but it didn't stop these lows. And it is absolutely incredible to see these systems that really can put the brakes on it. I mean, it's not perfect every time, right? But as you said, that time, I haven't heard that phrase, that time under range.
Time below range.
Time below range.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's really interesting to see.
Yeah. I mean, basically, it's just another way of saying lows, but I'm completely with you on automated insulin delivery. And When I started automated insulin delivery myself in 2017, I'd been living with type 1 for almost 30 years. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is the best thing we've ever had. And, when you've been living with type 1 for a long time and you come upon something that's way better, And so, as a peds endo, I started prescribing it to my patients and shortly after diagnosis. And some chose it, some didn't, right? And by the summer of 2018, about a year after the first Medtronic AID system had come out, I felt like I started to notice something. It seemed like the children who started automated insulin delivery within a month of diagnosis, right, were having longer honeymoons than those who didn't. And it led me to ask the question more formally, if we intensively manage type 1 diabetes right from the start and start automated insulin delivery, can we preserve beta cell function? And what are the glycemic outcomes? And so I'm really excited. I led a trial that became known as the CLEVER trial, closed loop and Verapamil. And I partnered with investigators across the country, as well as the JABE Center. And we were fortunately funded by JDRF. And so what we did was we did a study of over 100 children between 7 and 17. We randomized them within a month of diagnosis to either intensive management or to standard of care. And standard of care in the US for children when they're first diagnosed is CGM. So what we saw at 1 year was that the children who started automated insulin delivery within a month of diagnosis and had intensively managed diabetes, their time in range was 78%. And when you look at the children who did CGM alone, their time in range at 1 year was 64%. And we published this in February of 2023 in JAMA. And I think it really shows very convincingly from a randomized controlled trial that starting automated insulin delivery very quickly after diagnosis leads to better outcomes, and also that it can really be done in children. And I think that that's the shift that we actually need to see in the US is from the CGM first mentality to the AID system from the very beginning.
Just a couple of quick clarification questions. You said intensive management. People use that word differently. What does that mean in this context?
Okay, so in this context, the people that were in that intensively managed group, they had unlimited access to the healthcare providers. And so when you look at the difference between the two groups was primarily the technology, but they also had increased access to the study team.
Great. And was there a particular range? You said 78% time in range. Is that the standard? I think of that as 70 to 180.
Oh, okay, sure. So the recommendation, the international consensus, as well as the American Diabetes Association, is to spend over 70% of the time between 70 and 180. So those are the goals. And in this study, those who were randomly assigned to the intensive management with automated insulin delivery at 1 year were 78% time in range versus so clearly exceeding the goal, whereas those in the CGM alone were only at 64%.
Got it. And also there's a V in CLEVER, and that's Verapamil. That went by quickly. Tell us what that is all about.
Yes, that was really exciting. So there was a small study that had been done in adults that JDRF had funded, which demonstrated that if Verapamil was started shortly after diagnosis, that it could preserve beta cell function in adults. And JDRF had already agreed to fund the device part of our study. And they asked a group of peds endos, hey, how about you study Verapamil? And so we were excited to do that. So we studied Verapamil in these children as well. And while the automated insulin delivery had superior glycemic outcomes, it did not preserve beta cell function. The Verapamil did preserve beta cell function by 30% at 1 year.
Verapamil is a blood pressure medication. This is not like some fancy new crazy IV drug, right?
That's one of the things I think that is really exciting, actually, because the cost of it is low and it's potentially can be used by a lot of people.
In this study, I'm thinking of the Verapamil my husband took. It's a pill. Is it the same? It's a form? It's a pill?
It is. And now, we could have a conversation about how interesting it was to cut pills for children and have, because it has to be based on their weight and there actually is not an orally approved indication for Verapamil. But yes, you are correct.
Interesting. Okay. And before we move on from this, where does that stand? Because man, I feel like I've been following Verapamil and diabetes for many, many, many years. Still being studied?
It's still being studied. There are a number of other publications. I was, working on the trial before I joined Medtronic, and I'm not as closely involved. When I left that, Dr. Greg Verlenza kind of took over my spot, and they are following the kids out. And I think probably we'll have some follow-up data as well.
Great. Back to pumping, though. One of the really interesting things about this, to me, the system is the infusion set. I've been putting an infusion set on my son since he was 2 years old. It was one of the, worst experiences of pumping, frankly. It's tough to get it on a little kid. It's not pleasant to put it for an adult to put it on themselves. And it's kind of the weak link of pumping too, right? They fall off, they leak. So this extended wear infusion set is really exciting. Can you tell me a little bit about how it's working out? And I remember when hearing about this in the studies in Europe, that people were using it for the full 7 days. Is that still the case? Right back to the interview. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Edgepark. Take control of your diabetes with a broad range of diabetes management supplies from Edgepark. The latest diabetes supplies and continuous glucose monitors from top brands simplify blood sugar management. Edgepark accepts most insurance plans, and Medicare and Medicare Advantage cover certain devices. Plus, Edgepark takes care of the insurance paperwork to make ordering as seamless as possible. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Edgepark logo to learn more about Edgepark's diabetes supplies and CGM devices.
Absolutely. I'd be really happy to share the information about extended infusion set with you. And I first want to give credit to the PhD scientist and his team at Medtronic that are the ones who really brought this to life. And his name is Dr. Sarnath Chattaraj. And he and his team looked at, knowing that infusion sets are the weak link, and it's not great to have to change your infusion set every 2 to 3 days. How do we decrease the burden for the person living with diabetes? How do we extend that up to a week? What they did was they looked at the path of insulin from the vial all the way to the subcutaneous space. And then initially, when an infusion set is put in, there's some initial inflammation, but then there's also sustained inflammation from when it's in the body. And what Medtronic did was to really focus on that sustained inflammation. And so there's kind of 2 ways that it was approached. So there's sustained inflammation from insulin instability and insulin infusion. And there's also sustained inflammation from preservative loss. And so when you look at the extended infusion set, it was designed with new materials. So the first is the H-cap connector, and this new H-cap connector improves the insulin stability and the infusion set performance, allowing it to last longer. The second is the tubing. So the new tubing improves the insulin preservative retention and stability. And then finally, the adhesive patch, so improved adherence. And as far as wear time, I just checked before we went on air, and globally, the wear time is almost 7 days. So people are using this for a week. It's also, if someone is on a bigger dose of insulin, there's a process to change the reservoir out midweek, so you don't have to change the set. The other thing that I think is important to know for the little people who aren't on a lot of insulin, there is not a minimum fill. And so when, of course, there are always concerns about wasting insulin. And so that's another nice feature as well.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I remember when Benny was diagnosed, we called them wisps. Before he was even on an insulin pump, you're trying to measure in a syringe, like, how do I do a quarter unit? And then you get a pump and it's like 0.025. Yeah, I love it.
Okay, I have to ask you, as a T1D mom.
Yeah.
I had some moms, they said they were able to get down to an 1/8 of a unit on like a vial and syringe. Did you ever go to the 1/8, or you stopped yourself at the 4th?
It was 2006, and I can't say on the record exactly what we had access to, but the pharmacy gave me half unit syringes. So I didn't have access to a quarter unit measurement or 1/8 unit measurement. And God bless those moms. I was probably too lazy to do what maybe they took a ruler and marked it. I don't know.
They did that didn't exist. They did half of a half. I guess
that's what I did. I just eyeballed it. That's exactly what we did is we did we took a half unit syringe and we would eyeball it. And we would always laugh because my husband's draw was nothing like mine. We knew it was absolutely inaccurate. So we were so thrilled to get the insulin pump. And, now, of course, he's 19 and he takes 25,000 units of insulin a day. He's 6'1". So it's like a different story altogether.
Thank goodness for insulin pumps in progress.
Yeah. And even the pens have come a long way.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can be so much more accurate. No, it's toddlers and T1D is a total circus. But that leads me to a question about there is all this technology that's wonderful and is very advanced, but you live with this. There are so many challenges still. This is far from solved, right? And you still talk to patients. Well, let me get personal. Like, what are still some of the challenges that you face, if you don't mind sharing?
Sure. As you can imagine, I use a 780. And so when I look at the evolution from 2 injections a day of regular and NPH insulin that I started in January of 1988 and poking my finger, and it took 2 minutes to get a value, to now, it's amazing. What do I still want? I think, looking forward, automated meal handling completely for some of those times where I just forget to bolus or it's not convenient or whatever it might be. I look forward to that. Another thing I look forward to that I think has not been solved yet is exercise. I love to exercise. I love to work with people with diabetes and help them come up with plans so that they can exercise. I ran a marathon, but I don't think we've solved that quite yet. So I'm looking forward to that. I think faster insulins and a continued decrease in footprint and in burden, right? Like I think about now, I change my infusion set once a week. That's great. Maybe moving forward, you change it even less often, right? Like every piece of it, how can we continue to move diabetes to the background and not have it have to be always top of mind?
Yeah, it's such a challenge, that mealtime stuff. And maybe this is another time to ask you, the mealtime challenge is still so hard. I try not to nag my son. We really talk very little about diabetes. He's away at college. But when he's home, the hardest part for me is watching him eat and saying, did you bolus? Did you bolus? Like, I don't know. Did he bolus before he sat down? Is he doing it under the table? Is he, and he's like, Mom, like, I've got this. Relax. It's okay. I'm curious, as you said, the Medtronic 780 does not eliminate the need for mealtime boluses, but it does help correct. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I'm really curious how well something like that works. Like, have you challenged it? I mean, there's one thing to say, like, I'm eating a 20 carb lunch and oopsie, but I'm eating a pizza and going to bed.
Right. Well, let me tell you about a study that was done. This was done in Israel. It was a 3-month study. There were 14 adults. And for 3 months, they bolus for their meals. And for 3 months, they did not bolus for any of their meals if they were 80 grams of carbs or less. And their time in range was 67% without bolusing. Okay. Now, after having, this is published data, but I do want to, of course, we always recommend the best outcomes are seen before bolusing, but have people tested it? Absolutely. And I think what you see, okay, you think about the adolescent and young adult population that's up late, likes to snack and all of that. What used to happen in the past, right? The Ben and Jerry's, the pizza, whatever it might be. So where I went to college, they had these things called Dan's cookies. And at like midnight, they would deliver like a dozen cookies and milk, right? Doesn't that sound amazing? So anyhow, what would happen? Well, the person with diabetes would wake up in the morning high, right? And so that's really the magic of the 780 is that while the person is asleep, those auto corrections, you see them on the pump as these like blue lines that occur every 5 minutes, like they're really kicking in. And I'll share an experience with you. So when I was diagnosed in the late 80s, it was very different than it is now. When I was diagnosed, it was sort of like, this is your exact meal plan. You're going to follow this. You're never having sweets or candy again or things like that, right? And so it kind of stuck with me, unfortunately. That's, and I remember one night, I'd had the 780 for a few weeks and I was up late working and I grab a Diet Coke and I'm looking for something salty. The usual suspects for me are like dill pickles, nuts, beef jerky, right? All these things without carbs. And out of the corner of my eye, I see this bag of Sun Chips, like the Harvest Cheddar, which in my opinion,
so good.
to die for. Okay. And I pick it up and Stacey, I ate half the bag. Okay. That's more chips than I had probably eaten in the previous 20 years. I kid you not. So then I went to bed. Guess what happened? Nothing happened. The system kicked in insulin all night long. I woke up somewhere around 100. Now, I'm not encouraging people to eat half bags or full bags of Sun Chips every night. But if you do that, right, the system like kicks in insulin.
What is that like for someone who has lived with diabetes for a long time, starting at a time where it was very restrictive? And I'm sure you were told no a lot. Was that revelatory to you that next morning?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously been a journey. And I think one of the things, I think food is challenging for people with diabetes, right? Because there's sometimes blame and shame. And I think that what the system allows, I was like, I can eat this, right? And I'm not a bad person because my blood sugar is high, even though I don't believe anyone's a bad person if their blood sugar is high, right? But, you know, those stigmas they're out there and they're hard to get past. I never, when my family would go out to like Ben and Jerry's, I would like eat a tiny bite of someone else's, but I'd never get my own. And I get my own. Right now, I need to like exercise more as I get older, but like I get my own scoop, right? And so I'm excited with the technology that it allows me to do that because it's not something that I allowed myself to do before.
Okay, so you could have the scoop of ice cream, right? We've come a long way. I'm sure there's a lot more. I mean, you're running marathons and all of this. But you're from where you sit, right? You see so much more of the diabetes world. When it comes to type 1 in the United States, we've come such a long way, but there's really a long way to go. What are the challenges? What's the big stuff you want to see tackled?
Stacey, thank you so much for asking this question. I wouldn't have been able to have this perspective until the last couple of years where I've had this global role at Medtronic, because prior to that, I was in the US and primarily traveling in the US. But what I've seen spending time specifically in Western Europe is the significant difference in the treatment of type 1 diabetes, as well as the control of type 1 diabetes in Europe versus the US. And unfortunately, the US has a public health crisis for people with type 1 diabetes. And that public health crisis is hyperglycemia, high blood sugars. Dr. Ebikozian and his group at the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange published information in November of 2023 that the average hemoglobin A1C in the US is 8.4%. And when you think about the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial, which is the bedrock trial that we have used to care for people with type 1 diabetes for the last 30 years, we knew 30 years ago that the goal hemoglobin A1C to avoid short and long-term complications was an A1C under 7%. And today, the average A1C in the US is 8.4%. And when you look at all of the advances in the care of people with diabetes since then, looking back even to when you started your T1D journey, Humalog, Lispro didn't come out in the US till 1996, Glargine or Lantus 2001. Insulin pumps were around in the 80s and 90s, but hadn't really started to take off until the 2000s. CGM, kind of mid 2000s, but didn't really start to take off till 2012, 13, 14-ish. And then AID systems in the last, 5 years or so. And in that same paper, looking at type 1 diabetes exchange data, about 80% of the US is using CGM. But unfortunately, even with 80% of the US using CGM, the average A1C is 8.4%, and only 26% of Americans are achieving an A1C of under 7%. So why does it matter? Well, we know that hyperglycemia matters, both short-term and long-term. We know long-term because of the data from the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial, eye disease, kidney disease, heart disease. But sometimes I think it's hard to conceptualize that in the here and now because, that's many years down the road. But we're also learning a lot more about the impact of hyperglycemia on the brain, specifically in children and adolescents. There's work that's being done both in Europe as well as the US that has demonstrated that hyperglycemia impacts spatial working memory in adolescents, that is going to impact their ability to learn. There's also data that children with type 1 diabetes have lower brain volumes, lower IQs than age-matched controls without type 1 diabetes, and that difference, it persists, if not worsens over time, and is related to hyperglycemia. And there's another study that came out of Sweden that demonstrated that for people diagnosed with type 1 under 10 years of age, that 14 to 17 years of life are lost. And a lot of that has to do with hyperglycemia.
I want to stop you there just real quick. I mean, wow, right? But are those numbers, in terms of the complications, especially in the brain changes and things that you mentioned, were they recent? I mean, are you talking about kids that are studied in the last 10 years? Or are you talking about kids that were diagnosed in the 1970s and 80s?
So great question. The pediatric studies were all published in the last couple of years. Those are recent trials. The diabetes control and complications trial was, of course, very old. The data that I just mentioned from the Swedish registry about the years of life lost, that's been published within the last 5 to 10 years as well. And, the other thing that I want to mention is that when you look at, I mentioned the average hemoglobin A1C in the US is 8.4%. When you look at the average hemoglobin A1Cs in some of the Western European countries, they're much lower. And the reason is that they're focusing on the impact of hyperglycemia. And what I've come to notice is it feels like the US is focusing more on hypoglycemia. And of course, hypoglycemia is important to be mindful of. Now, fortunately, as you mentioned earlier, this is somewhere where CGM and AID are really helpful. And I actually pulled this data recently, but if you think of kind of the landmark CGM trial, it was published in 2017. And this was an adult trial, and it was MDI and CGM. And so in that trial, if you look at how much time someone with type 1 spent below 50 milligrams per deciliter, and that's the range where you're more likely to have an event, right? A severe hypoglycemic event where something happens, somebody needs help. It was 6 minutes a day, okay, under 50. Now, how much time were those people spending over 180 in the hyperglycemic range? Over 10 hours a day.
Wow.
Hyperglycemia, it's a public health crisis for type 1, and I think we can fix it. It's all about automated insulin delivery. So when you look at automated insulin delivery, what does it contain, right? It has CGM, it has an insulin pump, and it has the algorithm, right? The brains behind it that deliver the outcomes. What used to happen kind of earlier in my career, and you experienced this with your son, I imagine, because CGM was in its infancy when he started a pump, is that pumps were started first. And pumps are trying to emulate what the pancreas does as closely as possible, right? And so the pumps were started first. Then as CGM kind of started to come to light and, increased use, improved CGM, it became a CGM first. And CGM is critically helpful and impactful. But at the end of the day, it doesn't take action. That's where I feel we need to shift back to a system that takes action and incorporates the CGM, but is able to take action for the person with diabetes. And so when you look at AID system use and outcomes, that's where we really see the ability to help people achieve those A1Cs under 7% and that time in range over 70%. When you look at that type 1 diabetes exchange data, 80% of people in the US, almost 80%, are using CGM. Only about 30 to 35% are using automated insulin delivery systems. And when you take a step further and you think about using an automated insulin delivery system, I led the CLEVER trial, which demonstrated starting it shortly after diagnosis. And the other thing, when I think about starting someone on an AID system, it's really twofold, because it's not just about the metabolic outcomes, it's also about the burden and ease of use. And so you look at, how do I keep my patients safe and healthy? This is how I look at it as a healthcare provider. So that's the outcome. That's the metabolic outcome. I want the little people with diabetes that I care for to live long, happy, healthy lives, right? And then the other piece is ease of use, right? I want them to benefit from this technology. And I also want it to be easy to use. And so in my mind, those are kind of the things that as healthcare providers or also people living with diabetes, should be asking questions about as they're thinking about their therapies. But in my mind, we've proven that automated insulin delivery is far superior outcome-wise, burden-wise, and that's really the direction that I think the field is heading, and that it will really help a lot of people with type 1 diabetes in the US.
I have to go back to one thing you said for clarification. I mean, that was all great.
Sure.
I think it was Sweden when you said life expectancy decreased.
Yes.
But you were talking about how people in Europe seem to have better control. As a mom of a kid who was diagnosed before age 10, I need you to dig in a little bit and clarify that. Were those people having A1Cs under 7 and the life expectancy was still less?
This is registry data. I'm happy to pull the article for you. And
I think it's important.
You.
Yeah, because,
I know it's not fun to hear that.
It's not fun to hear that. And it also doesn't seem to line up with more recent information that, I'd have to pull out.
I think that's the harder part with some of the registry studies, that they look back, right?
Well, that's what I was asking, right? Was this someone born in 1950? Or was this someone born in 2000? How can you tell? Where do you get the life expectancy from? It can't possibly be from a 6-year-old today.
Well, it isn't from today because that requires, work to do the study and to publish it and all of that. So I'm happy to send you that study. And then there was another Swedish study that was published in 2014. I can send you both. If it was published in 2014, right? It's looking back over many years. The hard part about those studies when they get published is, okay, we're in 2024. So what they found in 2014 with the improvement in technology and other improvements in diabetes care, it's probably better, right? But I still don't know that it's matched to someone without diabetes.
Absolutely. And that's fair.
Yeah.
When you think about DCCT and the EDIC trial, I always have to point out to parents, look at this information and realize that these people were not born in the 2000s. They did not have access to what we have now. They may have spent their childhood with double-digit A1Cs.
Right.
And look how well they're doing now with the control that they have now. So I only like to caution because I feel like a lot of parents hear one thing from everything you just said and may focus only on that and feel like, why I can't do this at all.
Okay. I'm not sure that we as pediatric endocrinologists in the US really talk about some of the long-term impact maybe as much as we should. And I definitely don't want to scare anyone, but there was a paper that came out of the DCCT, and I can send you this one too. I'm sorry.
This is great.
Obviously, it's so interesting to me. It's really my passion. So what they did was they took person with diabetes A and person with diabetes B. Okay. Person with diabetes A has an A1C of 7 for 10 years and then an A1C of 9 for 10 years. Okay. Person with diabetes B has an A1C of 9 for 10 years and then 7 for 10 years. And when you look at those two people, the amount of glycemic exposure, if you will, is the same, right? However, the person that had the A1C of 7 for the first 10 years actually had a decreased risk of complications later on. The body, and it has a metabolic memory. And again, that's my passion around starting automated insulin delivery shortly after diagnosis.
That's fantastic. No, we could talk for hours, obviously, about all of this. I don't want to put out only happy information that's not accurate, right? It's that balance, though, of understanding. We're here at a podcast just chit-chatting, so it's hard to dig into a lot of the studies and see. So it's, that's the only reason why I asked.
The message I really want people, I'll tell you why I went down this route. So in 2018, I found out my daughter was antibody positive. And I really had been a doctor who was just seeing patients, right? Like that's what I wanted to help kids with diabetes. I wasn't doing research. And when that happened, I was like, okay, I got to figure out how to save beta cells. And anyway, that's what led to the Clever trial. And it's my passion behind all of this is because I want children and adults who are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes now to basically have the best outcomes possible and live long, happy, healthy lives.
If you don't mind me asking, how is your daughter?
She's great. So she at the time was 5 and now she is 10. She is an amazing hockey player. I live in Minnesota, and soccer player. She's still antibody positive. And I'm sure we could have a separate conversation just about what that's like, just the not knowing. And what do? We, put one foot in front of the other every day, just like everyone with type 1 does, and all the families in the T1D villages, and we move forward.
We talked a lot about research and automated systems. I don't want to say imagine how different your life would have been if at 11 years old, somebody had handed this to you, right? But you have to think about that sometimes. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just kind of reflecting on your experience at 11, thinking about the technology you have access to now.
Oh, I would love to. Well, the part that I'll have to say is that when I was diagnosed, the worst part was never the finger pokes or the injections or the dietary restrictions. The worst part was the exclusion. So I spent a week in the hospital and came back, and I was no longer allowed to go on field trips because the public school I attended thought that I was too much liability for the school. I didn't get invited to sleepovers. I was too much responsibility for the parents. And so my 11-year-old self decided, hey, guess what? If I never tell anyone I have diabetes, then I'll get included. And so I actually did injections for almost 2 decades because I wanted no one to know.
Wow.
It's kind of an irony that I actually work at Medtronic Diabetes as a medical director. So anyhow, when I turned 30, I decided I no longer cared. And it was the biggest weight left off my shoulders. But back to your question about what it would have been like, I have to say, Stacey, not only would my metabolic control obviously have been better because, I lived for almost 6 years before the DCCT was published, but I also, because people would have seen the technology, I would have had to accept it. I think I would have hopefully been accepted. I don't know. It's a different time. And I'm happy for no one who develops type 1 diabetes, but I think that now it's not the same stigma, while there are still some. Like when you see someone with a device, it's not the same as it used to be. And for that, I'm really happy.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate all your time. We went a lot longer than I had initially said we would. So thank you for sticking with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Stacey, I really enjoyed the time here today. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Once again, the studies that we talked about linked up in the show notes. And I think you can tell what I was trying to suss out there. How can they study lifespan in people who are living in their teens and 20s? When you look at the studies, some of this is extrapolation, but they are looking at more current diagnoses than I first assumed. I do wish I'd also asked her if one of the differences between better outcomes in some Western European nations was also because of their healthcare systems and about access to care and not so much focus on hypo or hyperglycemia, as she says. Hopefully I'll get the chance to follow up on that. And I think it's also worth noting, you as you listen, a podcast audience in general is not really the kind of audience that they study here. I mean, let's face it, if you're listening to a podcast about type 1 diabetes, you are super involved in your care, most likely. You have access to information, not really from me, but from experts and from educators, and you likely have a doctor, you likely have an endocrinologist. And, we know now that so many people in the US who live with type 1 don't have access to even an endocrinologist who lives, an hour away from them. It's unbelievable when you dial back. So the average A1C being so high really isn't that surprising when you think about it in terms of what care is like for so many people in the US and what access and affordability is like as well. It's not the most hopeful note to end on, but I will say, I think in the 9 years now that I've been doing this show, I actually think it's poised to get better. I think we're in a position now where these conversations are not just happening on podcasts like this. They're happening at the legislative level. And that's really what we need to make a difference. So much more to come on all of these studies. I'll definitely have Dr. McVean back And I've also followed up with Medtronic. We're going to do more of a deep dive into the technology pretty soon. I'm hoping at least by the time I go to ADA in June that we can have that conversation. All right, no travel on the books until June right now. That is the American Diabetes Association's scientific sessions in late June, and I will be going there. Keep you posted if anything pops up in May, but I do have a little bit of a lull. Our next Mom's Night Out events are not until the fall. All right, thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.
One of the things we love the most about the Dexcom G6 is that it helped Benny become more independent, but maybe not in the way you're thinking. I mean, remote monitoring using the Dexcom Share and Follow let us be more confident letting him do more away from home with friends or at camp. But just the design change of G6 meant Benny could use one hand to insert the sensor. He was 14. He didn't want our help anymore. It was perfect timing. Dexcom G7 is even more simple to use and gives effortless diabetes management that fits into your lifestyle without the disruptions. Ease of use helps everybody, and I'm grateful the Dexcom product designers kept that in mind with G7. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo.